Good morning. Had you met a much, much younger version of Stephen, you would have met a zealous fellow who genuinely believed that politics, earthly politics, were largely irrelevant to anything that really mattered. Some might say, oh, that's a position, Stephen, that you can really only hold if you happen to live under a political system either that is gently favourable towards you or else which is largely neutral to your sense of well-being and life purpose. And I guess if someone said that, that would be correct. Had I lived my youth under a government that either was strongly favourable towards me or else which was antagonistic or even hostile, I hardly imagine that I could have been sailing through life blithely unaware. That young Stephen was fervent about following Christ and then beyond conscientiously obeying the law of the land, his low level of interest in earthly politics depended on the luxury of a political system that largely felt benign, non-threatening, and mostly favourable to his prospects. Then, in his 20s, that young Stephen found himself building friendships with fellow believers who unmistakably regarded politics, earthly politics, as frankly very, very significant. It was quite entertaining, yet also quietly confronting. How can you live wholly for Christ and care which party happens to be in power? I remember one friend saying, "Should we watch the federal election count together?" Oh yeah, that sounds like fun. In the process, I discovered, whoa, you really, really care, don't you? And you, another friend, you deeply believe that there is one figure who stands head and shoulders above all the rest as our single greatest post-war Prime Minister. And you believe that political policy shapes lives. Somewhere in there, this is now around age 30, with Julie, I fell in love with The West Wing, that dreamy centre-left Hollywood version of the inner functionings of the White House. I couldn't tell you how many times Julie and I have watched together through the entire 7 seasons. And it was around that time that I finally twigged the Bible, and in fact, the core gospel message itself, is intensely political. To declare that Jesus is Lord, or to sing "Our God reigns," is inescapably political. And passages like today, this morning we're in the first half of Romans 13, passages like this started making more sense. That young Stephen, I guess, was a fine enough citizen, but in this area he had plenty of spiritual stretching and hard thinking still to do. How are we, who belong to Christ and his kingdom and the glories of eternity, how are we to posture ourselves towards flawed and fallible, error-prone and often grubby earthly governments? And especially, what about when government seems more like a foe than a gift? Because the thing is, whatever government you happen to live under, it's so easy to treat the authorities with disrespect, disregard, resentment, or even resistance. isn't it? It's entirely normal in Australia to dismiss our politicians as incompetent, self-interested half-twits. Why should we listen to them? Don't we know better? I started my direct preparation for this morning's sermon 2 days after lockdown began back in June. Almost every day over the past 8 weeks, it's so easy, isn't it, to question the reasonings and conclusions and public health orders and the motives of our own governing authorities. And perhaps we do that so as to play down the stay-at-home orders and to make up our own version of the rules, because really, secretly, I know better, don't I? Surely I know better. How many times have I spotted outright scoffing on social media from old friends, or in the public media, insulting diatribes? Surely we know better. Whatever government you live under, it is so easy to treat them with disrespect and resentment, even resistance. This is hardly a new phenomenon. We don't know exactly why Paul chose to include these precious paragraphs in Romans 13. Was it that there was still resentment stewing after all the Jews of Rome had been expelled very abruptly 8 years earlier, though subsequently, 3 years back, they'd been allowed to return? Or, given that they lived at the very heart of the empire, was it that they witnessed the grubbiness of government close up and were disinclined to hold the authorities in high esteem despite their dazzling city and superpower army? Was there already resistance to paying steadily rising indirect taxes? The historian Tacitus tells us that metropolitan Rome experienced a tax revolt the year after this letter was written. Or was there among the Christians a kind of sassy theological disrespect? Oh, surely we who belong to Christ, we don't need to pay that much attention to the authorities anymore. They're just the secular government. But Jesus is risen. Jesus is Lord. And this old age is defunct. Aren't we the seeds of the new creation? And so the bigger question is, well, how should we relate to those who govern us? What should be the basic posture of Christians towards the earthly authorities? Paul gives one simple command with a couple of big reasons, and then he spells out some implications. Whether or not you like it, whether or not your own personality predisposes you to conscientious law-keeping, both outwardly and also even inwardly, here is Paul's simple directive, verse 1. We can translate this very, very literally. Let every soul submit to the governing authorities. Let every soul submit to the governing authorities. Now notice, he does not use the word obey. Blindly obey. Paul knows full well that there are times when the faithful follower of Christ has no choice but to disobey the authorities. What had the Apostle Peter once exclaimed when the authorities instructed him to cease and desist from talking publicly about Jesus? Acts chapter 5, we must obey God, not you guys. So he doesn't say blindly obey. He says submit. Submit is about my basic posture. It says that my basic posture is to honour the authorities and to comply with their rulings, both outwardly, the letter of the law, and inwardly, the spirit of the law. It's about my posture. Let every soul submit to the governing authorities. Now, the big problem now is we are so strongly disinclined to submit to anyone. Ever since the garden, sin whispers, "Oh, you know better, don't you? Yeah, you know better. You don't need to submit." And we search for ways out. By any possible excuse, I'm thinking of various other New Testament passages here, who wouldn't prefer to avoid submitting to one's parents, or one's husband, or one's master, or one's church leaders, or even to God? But submission does not, when I submit, it doesn't demean me. Submission does not say somehow that one person is worth more than another. When Jesus himself voluntarily submits to the will of God the Father, that's a noble honouring of order. And so for me to submit to those whom God places over me turns out to be part of my own willing submission to God himself. My basic posture is to honour them. Very literally, verse 1, here's the instruction: let every soul submit to the governing authorities. Now, what are the two big reasons that Paul gives? I would say the key words are institution and purpose. We'll do them in that order. First, institution. Rather than abandoning us, God institutes governments for our good, verse 1. And so, verse 2, to treat them with contempt is to treat God with contempt and invite heavy judgment. Actually, this stopped me in my tracks when I noticed. Maybe you spot this also. 3 times through these 2 paragraphs, Paul refers to the governing authorities, surprise, as God's servants. Can you see some of them? Now, I think for some of our own governing authorities, this would be really quite the surprise. But the truth is, whether they know it or not, whether they embrace it or not, the government is established by God with a sacred role as his, I'll put it this way, his temporary public servants. I can't help but think of our Queen, whatever you happen to think of the constitutional monarchy. She knows she is God's temporary public servant. So what are Paul's 2 big reasons? The first one, God institutes governments for our good. Second, it's all about purpose. God establishes governments with a very important role to play, both negatively and positively. I'm now looking at verses 3 and 4. Whatever you may think of those who govern us, however worthy or objectionable you may find them, their authority is for the good order of society. They commend what is right and they punish those who do wrong. I think of the old police test. When I spot a police car in the street, am I happy to see them? Or am I desperately hoping they won't notice me? Am I discreetly tapping the brake and double checking my speedo? Or am I wandering over to thank them for looking after us? Are the cops friends or foes? Now, of course, police corruption is a known evil, but If I am generally pleased to see the police when I am keeping the law, and frightened if I'm breaking the law, well, that tells me that the authorities are actually doing what God intends. That is their purpose. And so, under God, governments have powers that individuals do not. There are two of them here in our passage. Governments have, verse 4, the power of the sword, which means it's not intrinsically immoral for a government to deploy either the military or the justice system to punish and even to kill. Though it would be intrinsically immoral for you or me. Governments have the power of the sword under God. In addition, in verse 6, governments have the power of taxation to enable government to function. I doubt they've thought of it this way, but the officials in the Australian Taxation Office are God's temporary public servants. Whether they know it or not, whether they embrace it or not, they are part of his purpose for our good, for the good order of society. God establishes governments, this is Paul's second big reason, he establishes governments with an important role to play, negatively and positively. Overall, God institutes governments for our good and the good order of society. Now, there are some objections. Is this everything that Paul could possibly say about earthly government? What if he knew that within a year of writing this letter, he himself would be imprisoned unjustly, and that would be the story for most of the next decade? What if he knew, say 10 years from when he writes this, about the persecutions under Nero? Surely he knows that power can be abused. What about bad government? What about when government does not act as God's temporary public servant? What about self-serving dictators with dreaded secret police at their disposal? Or what about the takeover of established governments by brute force? I have a couple of comments here. First, I would ask, what's worse? Bad government or no functioning government at all? And I'm now thinking particularly of the horrors of Afghanistan this week. I have never had to live under bad government, but no government at all is terrifying. With no government at all that's left is brute force and the law of the jungle. Even bad government is better than no government. And as a second comment, I would say, alongside Romans 13, we also need to reflect on Revelation 13. And this quick dip into Revelation has really whetted my appetite. I'm hoping I can come back for more. Almost 40 years after Paul writes to the churches of Rome, the Apostle John uses a kind of daring code in Revelation 13 to reassure believers who are suffering under bad government. And the Apostle John says to them, well, yes, the evil one is defeated, and yet the evil one is still able to oppress us. And very specifically in Revelation 13, the evil one is able to deceive the ungodly and persecute the godly using the state as his agent. Just sometimes the government must absolutely be resisted. Did you know this? In the 1940s, not only did he resist Nazi rule, pastor and theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer willingly joined in an assassination plot against Hitler in 1944. How do you get to that point? To reach such a point, I'm sure, involves very careful weighing of Revelation 13 alongside Romans 13. Desperately praying to God for wisdom to understand the times. So back to Romans. Some try to explain away these paragraphs so as to limit them or ignore them or avoid them. But could Paul possibly speak more plainly than this? Let every soul submit to the governing authorities. Verse 1, and then if you look for some of the instructions, verse 3, do what is right. Verse 6, pay your taxes gladly and willingly. Verse 7, give everyone what you owe. Which I think, oh, doesn't this echo the Lord Jesus? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, your taxes, and to God what is God's, your whole self. It's so easy to treat the authorities with disregard, disrespect, resistance. Surely I know better. But following Christ ought to make me a better citizen, adorning the gospel of Christ, and that especially impacts my attitudes and my posture towards those whom God places over us. Government is not a nuisance to be put up with. Government is a gift of God, instituted for our good. Now, I have no doubt that our own state government and its officials make mistakes, sometimes pretty serious mistakes. That's because they're human, like me. I'm not always happy about all the details of new public health order restrictions. What I must not do is treat them with contempt. I know that to govern with the whole picture in mind is fiendishly complex. And so I thank God that we have the government that we do. This is our duty. Pray for them and honour them. In honouring them, we honour the Lord, who put them there for such a time as this. Amen.